Welcome to the Safe, Stable, and Affordable podcast from the Polk County Housing Trust Fund. Each April, we host the Housing Matters Symposium focused on today's most pressing housing challenges and opportunities. This year's keynote speaker was Charles Marone, founder and president of Strong Towns. Hi, I'm Matt Hauge, Outreach Director for the Trust Fund. In this special series, we're sharing audio from the 2026 Symposium recorded live in Des Moines. Each episode features a different part of the event, highlighting a range of ideas, research, and local projects shaping the future of housing in Central Iowa. You can find more information about the event in the episode description. In this episode, we explore new research on missing middle housing in Central Iowa. The Polk County Housing Trust Fund partnered with the planning firm Confluence to identify underused sites across the metro that could support gentle infill and redevelopment. The project also visualizes what missing middle housing could look like in those places and how it could expand housing options in established neighborhoods. You'll hear from Abbey Eckberg and Jane Reisner of Confluence as they walk through the findings and what they mean for the region. Here's Jane now.
Essentially, the purpose of this project was to identify how and where and in what type of situations missing middle housing could be developed in infill properties within the region. And we figured that to start us off, despite the fact that we were at a housing symposium, and this might be a little bit more in the know of certain housing-related planning terms, we wanted to start off with some definitions so that we're all on the same page in regards to a few key terms that, frankly, you're going to hear a lot in this presentation. The first one is of infill residential development. Now, these are the definitions taken directly from the report, but simply speaking, infill residential is when housing is developed in areas that are have either previously been developed or are surrounded by areas that are previously developed. The opposite of it would be building on a agricultural farmland that's on the edge of town. So this could be a vacant property, it could be an underutilized property, or it could be one that there's a structure on site already that's either dilapidated and needs rehabilitation, or can be torn down in place of something else. It's often considered a more cost-effective way to develop because it doesn't rely on the extension of expensive sewer or water lines into new growth areas, as well as a more sort of sustainable and efficient use of land. I think we all know that endless sprawl and converting farmland or natural space into part of the built environment. Once you do that, you can't turn it back. And we don't often think of land as a finite resource, but it really is. We're not getting any more of it. So we need to be kind of respectful and keep it into the areas that have previously been developed. The next term is missing middle housing. Chuck talked about a lot of this in his previous presentation, but essentially missing middle housing is any housing type that falls between 2 points on a spectrum. On one end, you have a single family detached home, and on the other hand, you have a higher density apartment or residential building. And all of those different housing types that fall in between those two spectrums can be considered middle housing. And the reason we call it missing is because in recent development patterns, it has become increasingly more difficult to build these effectively. So this includes things such as row houses, townhomes, duplexes, triplexes. I'll never use the word ADU again. I can tell you that right now. That'll stick with me. And everything in between, cottage courts, or even garden-style, smaller-scale apartment buildings. So again, you'll hear these phrases a lot, but I wanted to start us off there. So we did a lot of different things in this project, but if we were to distill it down into 4 main tasks, the first one was to complete a land audit of all of the different parcels in Polk County to determine which properties would make the most sense for infill residential. Now, I imagine most of you in the room today, either on a walk through your neighborhood or perhaps on your way to work, pass by a property and think, gosh, why is this just parking lot? Why has nothing happened here? This could be so much more. And at a basic level, that is sort of an infill analysis project. I think all of us are guilty of that. And at a small scale or a neighborhood scale, it's pretty fun to do, and it's a pretty straightforward thing. I think it's very intuitive. But we were tasked with looking at properties across the entire metro area, across the entirety of Polk County, and determine where are those properties. So we had to try to be objective and look at To put it into perspective, 208,000 parcels, roughly speaking, in Polk County, and then to narrow it down from there. So how we did that was we applied a set of filters and queries to the parcel data, mainly in GIS, though there is some Excel work as well, and we tried to narrow in on those properties that we felt at this first pass would make the most sense. And Abby will talk a little bit more later on about what those specific queries and filters were. Now, task 2 was to review the results of that initial kind of narrowing in on a few parcels. Now, the amount that we were looking at was still considerably large. Abby will talk exactly about how many numbers we got to from that initial 207,000. But what we wanted to do was evaluate those properties and those parcels to see what were the common characteristics. And I want to make a note here before we move forward that even though we identified a set of specific parcels, the intent of this project was not to say, these are exactly where infill residential housing can go. We solved it, we found them all, here they are. That wasn't the intent here. But rather the intent was to look at the common characteristics of these sites so that we can try to figure out how we can group them into certain groups, which in this presentation and in this report we refer to as typologies. Now, we did this by evaluating the parcel shape, the size, the location. We looked at access to amenities of these properties at a high level. So are there parks nearby? Are there major employers? Are there transit stops? How useful are these sites? We also looked at the context of what was going on around these properties. So for example, if this was land just surrounded by industrial properties, our intent wasn't to say, no one else wants to live here, so let's put housing here. Well, that wasn't the goal here. We wanted to exclude those types of situations. And then we also wanted to look at some site characteristics. Is there a lot of parking on the site that is being kind of underutilized? Is it excessive? Is there any open space within the properties that we could be using for a different purpose? So at a high level, we reviewed these. We worked with the Polk County Housing Trust Fund staff and ultimately kind of categorized what we saw into 10 typologies. Spoiler alert, sorry, Abby. She'll follow a little bit more later on with some of the specifics of what the typologies were. And I realized I clicked ahead at some point. I'm so sorry. Task 3, once we had our 10 typologies, were then to create and work with landscape architects, including one that has an architecture background, to create 2 scale models of all of the different missing middle housing types. And I guess I should backstep for a second. I think the slide getting ahead got me jumped a little bit. We looked at all of the 10 typologies and then identified specifically which of the missing middle housing types would be most suitable for the different typologies. Kind of worked back and forth with the trust fund staff. Not everyone is going to work in every situation. And from there, we created the 3D to scale models of the different housing types included in the study. Now, we wanted to make sure that these were right-sized, they kind of fit kind of some standards, that they were realistic interpretations, square footages, unit counts, what have you. And then we wanted to make sure that our assumptions about what would work on the different typologies actually were valid. So we created 3D concepts and models that represented the typical typologies, the typical layout of the different 10 typologies that we had previously identified. So on the screen right now is an example of one. So this is more of a kind of greenfield spot that's surrounded by some low-density residential. This is specifically looking at the kind of viability of 2 ranch-style duplexes on the site. So where in the past we might think, okay, maybe 1 unit could be added here. Here's how we can do it that is appropriately scaled for the neighborhood, but we had 4 units instead of just 1. Now, the 4th big task in this project was to apply some real numbers to this. So we looked at regional market trends, we interviewed stakeholders, developers working in this type of housing development within the metro to get some real kind of cost numbers to the cost to build these type of units on the properties that we identified. To create this pro forma, we took into factors such as the net efficiency of the units, the cost per square foot, the cost per unit, and then the average cost to build. And we did as best we could to identify kind of what those averages were for every housing type within each typology. Now, there are a few sort of unknowns that we'll talk about briefly, things that were not necessarily factored into that pro forma for a variety of different reasons. but that'll be my next slide. So those were our 4 big tasks in this project. And before we dive deeper into the methodology, there are a few knowns and unknowns that we wanted to talk about that sort of led us, some assumptions that we had to make. Now, the first known and sort of one of the catalysts for this project is that there is a shortage of housing in the Des Moines area. We've worked on many comp plans in the region. We've looked at a lot of the regional studies that have come out, including the workforce housing strategy report from 2019 that showed there is a growing and expected to increase mismatch between the type of jobs coming into the Des Moines region, the wages of those jobs, and then the cost of housing that matches those wages. So this is not unique to Des Moines, but it is an issue. And missing middle housing in an infill pattern won't solve it, but it would be a step in the right direction. The next one, and Chuck did a great job of this already, is that there are zoning obstacles, right, in place to missing middle housing. There's a reason it's missing. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that, and I'm sure there are developers who disagree with me here, but generally speaking, it is fairly easy to both zone for and construct single-family homes. And it's relatively easy to zone for and construct apartment buildings. Chuck talked about this in his presentation earlier. Where it gets more challenging from a zoning perspective because of the way that we typically have zoned in the modern era is those commingling of different uses and density types gets complicated. Our system isn't necessarily set up for it how it is typically designed today. And so that is a very real factor here. However, it hasn't always been like this, and it doesn't need to be like this. If you were to take a walk through a neighborhood constructed, at least probably before the 1950s, you could find a really nice single-family home next to a duplex, down the street from a row of row houses, and then at the corner there might be a smaller scale apartment building, all nestled together in a really nice, walkable neighborhood. We know these exist, we know it can be done, but now our development style has become much more homogeneous with row after row of single-family homes, and this is a modern problem, I would say, and I know there are a lot of strategies, including the ones Chuck talked about in his presentation of how to kind of move forward best with this, but this is a very real thing. And lastly, another known for us is that this is a pressing issue because we know growth is happening in the Des Moines region and expected to continue to grow. And there has to be a viable option for us to approach how we provide enough housing for this growth without just endlessly expanding outward into the agricultural areas of the county. All right, and now there are a few unknowns, and a lot of this come back to that pro forma that I mentioned in task 4. Now, one thing that we could not accurately put into our pro forma was the cost of land acquisition. And there's a lot of reasons for this. One, it's highly variable depending on the different typologies and where you are within the metro, what's the surrounding context. And also, it would be immediately out of date, right? So if we're gonna be using this in the next 5 or 10 years, this is an ever-changing thing that is gonna vary case by case, and just it is a known cost. We just didn't exactly apply a number to that known. Another thing that you'll see in the different typologies is that some of them rely on us adaptively reusing either a commercial or an office property. Now, the cost of an adaptive reuse for, say, an office building is going to be extremely case dependent as well, and it didn't feel like there was any way for us to accurately build that into our pro forma. Another factor unknown is that there are certain building codes triggered at certain density levels, and this varies by city and city depending on what amendments they have, and there are different costs and kind of challenges to development based on this that we did not feel like we could accurately build into our pro forma as well, but it is a factor. And lastly, the fourth unknown is one that plagues us in all planning projects, I think, and that is of property owner interest. Yes, we have identified sites. Yes, they are scattered throughout the metro area, but if the property owner isn't willing to play ball, we could have the best site in the world, but our hands are tied. So, of course, we cannot predict that as we move forward with these sites. So again, this is a very high-level overview of our project, and now Abby is going to dive into some of the deeper methodologies. Thank you.
All right, so moving into the nuts and bolts of how this report was really constructed. So in order to get to our final outputs and final findings and recommendations, we really needed to kind of parse this out into bite-sized pieces, because as Jane mentioned, we had 208,000 parcels that we had to work through. So really making sure that we were clear, concise, and being efficient with kind of our time and data analysis, we had to break this out into 3 kind of separate steps here. The first being data gathering. So we leveraged Polk County data sets from the assessor to identify the parcel level data with details related to ownership, occupancy and class, jurisdiction, parcel size, assessed values, really fun stuff, lots of attribute fields, very exciting data. We also leveraged our subscriptions to CoStar to identify vacant and underutilized or chronically vacant retail and office properties to bring into that conversation for potential infill and redevelopment sites. Lastly, we pulled in FEMA and USGS data sets to identify sensitive natural features. So where's that floodway, floodplain? Are there wetlands? Are there things that we're going to have to factor out that just are going to be prohibitive to development? So as Jane mentioned, with those 208,000 parcels, we whittled that down. You'll see here with that yellow box there. But first off, we really wanted to start building out these queries and how were we going to move forward with parsing out that data, what was going to be suitable for that infill residential development. And really we started asking ourselves, okay, who are the partners of Polk County Housing Trust Fund? Who are the people that are going to be turning to this report and saying, okay, here are our opportunities? And so we first framed that through the sense of public, semi-public, and faith-based owned properties in the county today. We then coupled that in with the retail and office properties that we found through CoStar and kind of the data sets that we pulled in there. All that to say we brought that number down significantly to 14,570. At this point in time, we actually did feel comfortable to go through a parcel-by-parcel analysis, and so that took a lot of coffee and a lot of sanity, but we got through it. And so through that parcel analysis, we, again, utilized our local knowledge, proximity and location on those parcels themselves, general site characteristics, size, ownership, where it's at, and just seeing if it actually made sense and if it was viable. So again, we kind of went through and did our own gut check. We had conversations with Polk County Housing Trust Fund, and we started to identify, like, yeah, this makes sense. We're starting to see some consistencies. We're starting to see some groupings of commonalities within these outputs. And then that ultimately resulted in 744 sites of opportunity that we then developed out our 10 typologies. So this heat map here demonstrates where those sites of opportunity are located in the county today. So the brighter the orange, the higher density of opportunity sites, the lighter the blue, the fewer. Now, we illustrate this and we show you this map, again, not to say these are the exact sites that you should go to and seek out. These are the ones that we need to see having infill development happen. These are really just to illustrate for, again, the hopeful incremental developers that we want in the communities here, that there are realistic opportunities for infill development, especially in the sense of missing middle housing. This map, this data set, everything in this report really truly demonstrates that there is opportunity and that there's great potential for this in our communities. So as we went through then those 744 parcels and sites of opportunity, we really wanted to build out what did those look like, what were common themes and characteristics we were seeing in them. Were they all street fronted? Were they all rear access? Were there a lot of flagpole lots? The answer to that one was yes, there was a lot of flagpole lots. So ultimately then those 10 typologies were developed out. And so this looked at, again, faith-based infill development from green spaces to parking lots, undeveloped publicly owned land, standalone excess parking, commercial from a medium to large siting there, office buildings and office parks, again, those flagpole lots, and then greenfield land assembly that's more privately held. So at this point in time in the project, we were feeling pretty comfortable with what the categories we had developed out to be. And so we developed this memo to really go through each of them individually, talk about those site characteristics, what would be those potential opportunities and constraints with actually developing on a property like this. And then we developed out a 2D rendering of what those site characteristics could look like. And so we'll get into a bit more of those details here in a few slides. So by this point, we had gone through all the data. We had identified, is this a realistic kind of query? Are we in the right conversation? Are we finding the right potential sites? Developing out then those typologies led us into the kind of the next round of iterations for the report and the project itself. So we finalized those typologies. We had some really great conversations with stakeholders. We developed out the pro forma for each of the housing types that we're proposing in the plan. And then we really began to visualize these from that 3D sense and building out the report, ultimately producing then that housing sites of opportunity. So as mentioned, we had hosted stakeholder interviews, and these were really fruitful conversations for us during this project, really to discuss and engage with active missing middle developers in our county today. So special shout out to any of the developers that are here and present. Your contributions were very helpful for the development of this plan itself. And so we had a lot of really exciting conversations because we don't get to talk about housing development and really nerd out to the levels that we did in these conversations with folks. So it was a really fun time. But I think a lot of the things that we want to draw your attention to is the consistency and constraints are felt across the board from the developer level to the planner level. And so we heard that time and time again of like land is just varied, infrastructure, it's hit or miss. Zoning is always a fun conversation, and then moving into the NIMBY side of things. However, there was a lot of great opportunities and creative solutions that we had conversations around of how can we overcome this? What are we going to do? How can we implement this? And so that really helped guide a lot of the recommendations that we kind of pull forward in the plan itself. So as we moved from the 2D memo into then the proforma and then the 3D visualizations, you can kind of see a step-by-step approach of how we accomplished this. So the first one being, we had those 2D renderings that showcase what those site characteristics are. In this case, this is a greenfield site from a faith-based organization. So you can kind of see there's some excess green space around the property itself meant for further potentially parking lot expansion. But if we could actually turn that more into housing and be productive into kind of contributing to that housing stock need that we have, then we can demonstrate what that would look like. So our second step was really developing out what we're calling kind of the playing cards, the puzzle pieces that we can plug and play within these developments to showcase what that development or housing type would look like. So we have everything from ranch-style duplexes that you see on the screen here to garden apartments, cottage courts, and everything in between. So then we take those plug-and-play kind of housing types as we worked with our landscape architects to model these out. And you can see that very number 3 there, the 3D modeling of what that would look like in built form, accounting for ingress and egress, looking at setbacks, looking at all the things that we're going to get questioned on as saying, well, is this actually possible? Can we actually do this? And this model takes all of those kind of hard-hitting questions into consideration there. So I won't go into too much detail on the proforma. I will say that there's a very nice spreadsheet that laid all of this out, and it was very fun to build. But the way that we've outlined the proforma was in conjunction with some of the feedback we received from our stakeholders and what they're seeing in assumed cost per square foot for construction in the market today for actual missing middle developments in the communities that we're in. We lay out all the terminology. We want to make this approachable and understandable for everybody reading the term or reading the terminology and how we're building out these recommendations. And so we go through each of those proformas for each of the housing types and lay them out within those playing cards that you see, especially for the one on the screen here for ranch-style duplexes. So getting a better sense of what that would look like in terms of numbers, but then also what that would look like in terms of the built environment. So next, and we'll be brief with these, is moving into the sample opportunity sites, and wanted to share a couple of what these actually translated into for the recommendations. The first one being parking lot infill. I think if there's a common thing we can all observe of our communities is we've got a lot of parking, and we could revamp it, reimagine it. So in this case, we were looking at some excess spaces that you see here on the screen. On that far left side, looking at where there's just maybe 3 or 4 cars parked there right now. It's not peak, it's not the area to be parking in, it's not in closest proximity to any of the businesses themselves. So how can we turn this into productive housing? In this case, we looked at our townhome development and helped to visualize what that could look like in this area. We could have shared parking solutions here. We could talk about what the cost to build is. We could have shared central amenities where it's looking out onto a green, providing, again, more of those quality of life factors for the residents of that area. It's in walkable distance to commercial or retail services. It could be in walking distance to schools and everything else in between. The next one, looking at public vacant lot infill. So as we can see in this neighborhood, it's nestled on a corner lot across from pre-existing residential at varied scales. We've got duplexes across the street in this case. We've got single-family residential surrounding it. So what could that look like in built format with ranch-style duplexes? So we're again street-fronted. So taking what could have been maybe just 2 units being added to the landscape today, we're expanding that to 4. Okay, so looking at next steps for implementation, I'll pass this one back over to Jane here.
Right. So I think we could probably just have a QR code to the housing reports on the Strong Towns website here. And a lot of these have already been touched on in the previous presentation in terms of what sort of specific zoning obstacles. And there's a lot of ones specifically laid out in the report, but they all basically revolve around this idea of being flexible with our parking requirements. That is a big obstacle to incorporating these into the infill environment. And then a lot of them also relate down to design quality and review, and requirements, excuse me. So things like reevaluating setbacks, reevaluating some of those specific things that, frankly, Chuck talked about in his previous presentation, as well as we've included a conversation about how form-based codes that look at form instead of use can be perhaps an alternative to this as well. And then lastly, and this is, again, Chuck kind of stole our fire on this one, but no, that's okay, is allowing housing by right, particularly in our residential districts for these missing middle housing unit types, but also in some of our commercial districts as well. Remove the hurdles, remove the obstacles to making this happen. It doesn't have to be a controversial thing.
All right, so the next super exciting topic is building code amendments. So I'm sure as many of you know, especially if you're active developers in the area, the International Residential Code maxes out at 2 units currently, and then anything that's 3 units or more is triggered by the IBC then. So in our kind of conversations and ways to creatively adapt this would be looking at how to explore those opportunities to allow more densities to fall under the IRC, so through local code amendments and adoptions to those. That would help be more cost prohibitive of significantly decreasing than how many more units we can add under that IRC umbrella and allowing more units to just kind of streamline into that kind of cost to construct there. The last one we wanted to showcase was programs and incentives. So through these conversations, especially with our stakeholders, I think to no surprise, workforce housing tax credits, tax increment financing, and low-income housing tax credits were the top 3 most mentioned kind of layering financing tools that developers are actively implementing and utilizing today. The one that we wanted to highlight as a special kind of consideration for positive impacts of programming we have in our local communities today is from the city of Des Moines with their missing middle residential tax abatement program. We heard many positive things of how this is making missing middle development actually happen in our communities today. So capturing anything from 2 to 12 units and how we can continue to support and prioritize that. Lastly, looking at land acquisition cost incentives. So maybe there's developers coming to you and saying, we want to look at this infill lot, we want to have missing middle housing constructed here. And so is there kind of gap financing? Are there different incentives that we can consider that would help make those more financially feasible and draw more people in for those missing middle conversations in our communities? And that is all we have for you all today. The report is officially live, so if you go to the link on the screen here or scan that QR code, you are able to read it in full detail. But thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Safe, Stable, and Affordable from the Polk County Housing Trust Fund in Des Moines, Iowa. To learn more about our events and programs, subscribe to the podcast or visit pchtf.org.